My name's Alan. I'm 46, and I'll be honest with you. Family has always been the one thing I thought I could count on. I'm not naive. I know parents can play favorites. I know siblings compete. And I know not every family dinner is straight out of a holiday commercial. But I really believe that when it came to the big moments, the milestones, you show up for each other. You celebrate. You put aside your petty differences and give people their due. Turns out, I was wrong. Painfully wrong. I have one daughter, Emily. She's 18, smart as they come, and she's the kind of kid who makes you proud without even trying. She's never been flashy or loud. She's always been the hardworking, quiet achiever. While my brother's son, Jason, was the loud, always in trouble kind of kid who somehow still got showered with praise from my parents. My brother, Mark, has always leaned on my parents financially, rent, down payments, even Jason's endless emergency funds for things like wrecked cars and failed side hustles. Meanwhile, Emily worked part-time all through high school, saved her money, and graduated near the top of her class. I wanted to do something big for her, something that screamed, "We see you, and we're proud." So, I booked a private hall for her graduation party. Not just a back room at a restaurant, but a real event hall, fully catered, with decorations, music, everything. It cost me around $5,000, which, to be honest, is a lot, but I didn't mind. Emily deserved a moment that was hers and hers alone. I had spent weeks planning with the event manager, picking out her favorite colors for the theme, arranging a slideshow of her childhood photos, and even hiring her favorite local bakery to make a custom cake with her name on it. I pictured her walking in, seeing it all laid out, and knowing, truly knowing, that her hard work was noticed. The day of the party, Emily and I drove over together. She was so excited, even though she tried to play it cool. She kept smoothing down her dress and asking, "Do you think people will actually come?" I told her, "Of course they will. You've earned this." But when we stepped through those doors, everything stopped. Instead of banners that read, "Congrats, Emily," or table cards with her graduation year, all I saw was blue and gold balloons, streamers, and a massive banner strung across the back wall that said, "Congratulations, Jason," in bold letters. Jason, my nephew, my brother's kid, the one who barely scraped by, who my parents had to bribe into finishing his classes. Emily froze. She looked at me like she'd just been punched in the gut, her eyes flicking from the decorations to me, waiting for me to explain how this could possibly be a mistake. I couldn't even breathe for a second. My brother Mark came strolling over, big grin on his face, like he was the guest of honor. "Glad you guys made it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Pretty great, huh? Mom and Dad thought it made more sense to do it this way. Two birds, one stone, you know." He said it so casually, like this wasn't Emily's party, like it was never meant to be hers at all. I remember looking over at my parents. My mom just shrugged, smiling that patronizing smile she uses when she thinks I'm about to make a scene. She said, "Alan, it made more sense this way. We couldn't justify throwing two parties when they're both graduating. And Jason needs this encouragement more than Emily. She'll be fine. She always is." My dad chimed in with, "Don't start, Alan. Everyone's already here, and we don't want drama." Emily didn't say a word. She sat down at one of the tables, hands folded in her lap, and stared at the tablecloth while the room buzzed around her. My heart broke in that moment. This was supposed to be her day. She had worked for this, sacrificed for it. And instead, she was sidelined in favor of Jason yet again. Every time she glanced up and saw his name on those decorations, I could see her shrink a little more. I tried to talk to her, to reassure her, but what could I even say? "Sorry, sweetheart, your grandparents decided your achievements aren't worth celebrating?" The worst part was seeing Jason lap it up, posing for pictures under that banner, soaking in the praise, while Emily sat in silence. At one point, someone asked if she wanted to get up and say a few words. She just shook her head, and her eyes were shining like she was holding back tears. That image is burned into my mind. The anger that started building in me was something I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to tear down that banner, to scream at my parents, to walk out with Emily and leave them all to their little charade. "But Emily," she whispered, "it's okay, Dad. Don't make it worse." So I bit my tongue. For the rest of the evening, I stayed by her side, watching as my family clapped for Jason, toasted Jason, and completely ignored the daughter I had spent $5,000 to honor. The daughter who deserved every ounce of that recognition and got none of it. On the drive home, Emily stared out the window the entire time. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just held herself so tightly, like she was trying not to unravel. I told her how proud I was, how none of them mattered, how this didn't change her accomplishments. But I knew those words weren't enough. They had taken something from her that night, something they couldn't give back. That's when something in me snapped. Because here's the thing. I've been helping my parents financially for years. They couldn't afford their mortgage without me covering the difference. Every month, I made sure that payment went through. They never thanked me for it. It was just expected, like I owed it to them. And while they were busy playing favorites, throwing away my daughter's moment, they were living comfortably because of me. I sat there that night, staring at my laptop after Emily went to bed, and for the first time, I thought, why am I doing this for people who can't even respect my child? So I didn't. The next morning, I didn't make that payment. I didn't send the money. And within 24 hours, my phone was blowing up with messages in the family group chat. Begging. Panicking. My mom asking if I had forgotten. My dad saying they couldn't afford the payment without me. Mark chiming in, telling me not to be petty and to think of the family. Emily walked by as my phone buzzed on the table, and I swear, for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of a smile on her face. But I hadn't even begun to respond yet. I just sat back, letting their panic build, knowing that for once, they were the ones holding their breath and waiting on me. And that's where things started to shift. When I didn't answer the group chat right away, my phone started lighting up nonstop. At first, it was the usual, my mom sending strings of question marks, little Alan, messages, as if maybe I'd just forgotten or overslept. But then it escalated. By mid-morning, my dad had sent a long paragraph about how the mortgage company doesn't wait and how responsible adults don't miss payments. I sat there with my coffee, scrolling, and for the first time in years, I wasn't panicked. Normally, the idea of my parents struggling would twist me up with guilt. But after what they did to Emily, I just felt detached, almost like I was finally watching them from the outside. Mark, of course, couldn't help chiming in. He wrote, "Look, man, I know you're upset about the party, but don't punish mom and dad. They were just trying to do what made sense for everyone. You've always had it easier, and Emily's fine. She doesn't need all that attention. Jason needed a win. Don't be selfish." Reading those words made my blood boil. Selfish. That's the word he used on me. As if quietly covering my parents' mortgage for years without recognition was selfish. As if giving up thousands of dollars I could have saved for Emily's college was selfish. And the kicker? Jason needed a win. Not earned, not deserved. Needed. As if my daughter's accomplishments could just be repurposed into his. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch. And that's when the real manipulation began. My mom called me directly, her voice sugar-sweet, like she used to talk to me when I was a kid and she wanted me to give my last cookie to Mark. She said, "Alan, honey, you can't let your pride get in the way of family. We've always counted on you. You know we can't manage without your help." She didn't once mention Emily, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge what happened at the party. It was all about them, about how this missed payment would ruin their credit and put them in a terrible position. I asked her flat out, "Do you even realize what you did to Emily? Do you care how humiliated she felt?" There was a pause, just a few seconds, and then she sighed. "Alan, you're being dramatic. She's young, she'll forget about it. Jason's the one who struggles. You know that." That moment hit me like a brick. It wasn't even a slip, it was the truth. They didn't think Emily's achievements mattered because she was competent, reliable, strong. And because Jason was their project, their golden boy who always needed saving, they were willing to throw my daughter under the bus. That week became a game of cat and mouse. Every day, I woke up to new messages. My dad tried a different approach, authority. "Alan, this isn't optional. We're your parents. You don't just stop supporting your family because you're angry." Like it was a duty, like I was their employee and this was my job. He even tried guilt-tripping me about the roof you grew up under and how I should repay that debt. I wanted to laugh. That roof only stayed over our heads because my grandmother left them the house, and because I, later on, kept their bills afloat. But they twisted it into something they had given me. Meanwhile, Mark started stirring the pot even more. He called me one night, trying to act like the peacekeeper. His voice was all faux concern. "Look, Alan, I get it. You feel slighted. But you can't just cut them off. They're too old to figure this stuff out on their own. And honestly, It's not fair to Jason either. That last part nearly made me choke. I asked him, what does Jason have to do with their mortgage? And he actually had the audacity to say, well, if mom and dad lose the house, where do you expect him to go? You know he's not stable yet. I swear, I had to grip the phone to keep from throwing it across the room. They weren't just depending on me for themselves. They were counting on me to bankroll Jason's fallback, too. The more they pushed, the more Emily noticed. She'd sit at the kitchen table doing her summer assignments, her phone buzzing with the same group chat notifications. She asked me once, quietly, "Are you going to give in?" I looked at her and saw that same tightness in her shoulders from the party night. That hesitation, like she didn't believe her happiness was worth fighting for. And I realized that's what my family had done. Years of favoring Jason had trained her to think she didn't deserve more. That was the moment I knew I couldn't cave, no matter how ugly it got. Things got uglier fast. My parents stopped with the polite messages and started playing dirty. My mom wrote in the group chat, "Alan is punishing us all because Emily can't handle sharing a party. Everyone should know the truth." She was trying to turn the extended family against me, framing it like I was some spoiled dad throwing a tantrum. Mark piled on, writing things like, "Yeah, Emily looked fine to me. She wasn't even upset. Alan just wants everything to be about him." That one almost made me laugh, because if anyone wanted everything to be about them, it was Jason, standing under that banner like he'd just won the Nobel Prize. By the end of the week, my parents invited Jason and Mark over to their place and sent me a picture. They were all sitting on the porch, smiling, with the caption, "Real family sticks together." It was like they were daring me to break, to see myself on the outside and crawl back for approval. For a split second, I felt that old ache, the one from childhood, when Mark was always first and I was always the afterthought. But then Emily walked into the room, saw the picture, and just shook her head. "They'll never change, Dad," she said. And she was right. Still, the pressure didn't stop. My dad called me late one night, voice low and angry, telling me they'd already gotten a notice from the bank. He said, "If this place goes under, Alan, it's on your head. Don't think people won't remember who let their parents become homeless." It was pure manipulation, but it stung. Because even when you know it's unfair, hearing your own father say you're the reason they might lose their house hits deep. I hung up on him, but I couldn't sleep after that. I sat there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was really ready to let this play out. The next day, Emily brought me breakfast in bed, toast, eggs, nothing fancy. She sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I don't want you to feel guilty for me. I just want you to stand up for yourself. For us." And that's when I knew. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even just about the graduation party. This was about decades of being second to Mark, about my parents seeing me as a wallet, and about my daughter learning from me what she should or shouldn't accept in life. If I caved now, I'd be teaching her the wrong lesson. So I didn't cave. And when the next mortgage date came and went, the storm really hit. My parents showed up at my house. Not a call, not a message. Physically at my front door, knocking until Emily peeked through the blinds and whispered, "Dad, they're here." My stomach dropped. Because this wasn't just going to be guilt-tripping texts anymore. This was going to be face-to-face. And judging by the look on my dad's face when I opened the door, it was going to get ugly. And that's exactly where things started to unravel, in ways I hadn't even imagined. When I opened the door, my parents were standing there like they owned the place. My dad had that familiar stern look he used whenever he wanted to intimidate me as a kid. My mom was already in tears, not real tears, but those half-performative ones she could summon when she wanted to look like the victim. Behind them, Mark leaned against his car at the curb, arms crossed, like some self-appointed bodyguard. And of course, Jason was in the passenger seat, blasting music loud enough to rattle the windows, like this was all just background noise to his life. "Alan," my dad said sharply the second I cracked the door. "We need to talk." Now, Emily had come to stand just behind me, holding onto the side of the doorframe like she was bracing herself. I could feel her tension radiating off her. She shouldn't have had to hear any of this, but part of me knew it was better she did. Better she saw who they really were, without the rose-colored filter I'd been guilty of putting over them for too many years. I stepped out onto the porch, closing the door gently behind me so Emily wouldn't be dragged into the front line. My mom immediately launched into it. "Alan, we can't live like this. The bank is calling. The late fees are stacking up, and your father's health can't take this stress. Do you want him to have another heart episode? Is that what you want?" There it was, using his health as leverage. He hadn't had a serious issue in years, but she threw it out like a loaded weapon. I folded my arms, refusing to take the bait. "You knew when you decided to hijack Emily's party that there'd be consequences," I said. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "You made a choice. Now I'm making mine." My dad's jaw tightened. "This is not about some silly decorations, Alan. You're jeopardizing your family's future over hurt feelings. You're supposed to take care of us." "You mean bail you out?" I shot back. "You mean clean up every mess while Mark and Jason coast along? You threw my daughter aside for him, and you expect me to keep footing the bill like nothing happened?" "No." That's when Mark decided he had to jump in. He pushed off his car and walked up the driveway, voice dripping with that smugness he's perfected since we were kids. "Don't turn this into some martyr act, Alan. You've always had more. More money, more stability. Mom and Dad can't survive without you, and you know it. But instead of helping, you're punishing everyone because Emily couldn't handle sharing a spotlight. Grow up." I felt my hands clench at my sides. I wanted to deck him right there, but I forced myself still. It wasn't about sharing, Mark. It was about respect. Something you've never understood, because you've always had it handed to you. The standoff might have ended there, just words traded back and forth like always. But then my dad did something I'll never forget. He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket and held it up. "You think you're so indispensable, Alan? Well, you're not. We've already fixed it." At first, I didn't understand. Then he shoved the envelope into my chest, forcing me to take it. Inside was a letter from the bank. But it wasn't about a missed payment. It was paperwork for transferring financial responsibility. My parents had gone to the bank behind my back, using my information, and signed me as a co-borrower on their mortgage. Without my permission. For a second, I couldn't even process it. My head spun. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. My mom piped up quickly, defensive. "We only did it because we knew you'd come around eventually. It's just a formality. You've been paying anyway. The bank just needed someone reliable on the paperwork." Reliable. That word cut deeper than I expected. To them, I wasn't a son. I wasn't a father to a daughter who deserved better. I was just reliable. A walking safety net they could tie themselves to, without even asking. "You forged my signature?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark actually laughed, a short, mocking sound. "Don't be so dramatic. They didn't forge anything. They just expedited what was already happening. You've been paying for years. It's the same thing." But it wasn't the same thing. It was a betrayal on a level I didn't think they were capable of. This wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. This was illegal. They had tied me financially to their sinking ship without even giving me a choice. I could feel Emily's eyes on me from inside the house, watching through the blinds. And I knew she saw the moment something in me broke. "You had no right," I said slowly, every word deliberate. "No right to decide for me. You've used me my entire life, and I let it happen because I thought that's what family did. But this crosses a line you can't come back from." My dad tried to assert his authority again. "We did what needed to be done. Family sacrifices for family. You'll thank us one day when you understand." I stared at him, at both of them, and for the first time, I didn't see my parents. I saw people who would sell out their own son without hesitation if it kept Jason comfortable. People who would smile at my daughter's tears and call it making sense. People who believed love was measured in dollar signs and obedience. I handed the envelope back and said, "You just made the worst mistake of your lives." Then I turned, opened the door, and walked back inside, leaving them on the porch. Emily was standing there, wide-eyed. She asked softly, "What did they do?" I couldn't even answer right away. I just pulled her into a hug, holding her tighter than I ever had. Because in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just about the graduation party anymore. It wasn't about one night, one banner, one slight. It was about years of being treated like an afterthought, like a resource, like a tool. And now they'd crossed a line so deep, the only way forward was to fight back. But how I would fight, that's the part one hadn't figured out yet. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smug envelope, saw Mark's smirk, heard my mom's voice saying formalities, as if stealing my signature was just paperwork. And underneath all of it, I felt something else creeping in, a cold, steady resolve. Because if they thought they could tie me down without consequences, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. And that's when the real planning began. When I shut the door that day, I thought I could just lock them out, physically and emotionally. But betrayal doesn't sit quietly in the corner. It gnaws at you. It follows you into every room, into every thought. That envelope, those papers, they were like a parasite in my head. I couldn't stop replaying it over and over. My parents had taken my name, my trust, and twisted it into another chain to keep me tied to them. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself, maybe the bank won't process it. Maybe it's just another empty threat. But a week later, an official-looking packet arrived in the mail, confirming what I already knew in my gut. The mortgage had been restructured, and my name was on it. Just like that, I wasn't just the reliable son anymore. I was legally bound to their mess. When I opened that envelope at the kitchen table, Emily was sitting across from me with her laptop. She saw my face before I could school it, and she asked, "It's worse, isn't it?" I didn't want to burden her, didn't want her to carry the weight of what her grandparents had done, but she wasn't stupid. She'd grown up watching the favoritism, the way I was treated versus Mark, the way Jason was coddled. She knew. I said, "It's official now. They made me part of the mortgage." She just stared at me, then shut her laptop and came to sit beside me. She didn't say much, but she put her hand on mine, and in that small gesture, I felt both comfort and shame. Comfort that she was with me, shame that she had to witness all of this. The days that followed felt like sinking into quicksand. I'd go to work, smile through meetings, pretend everything was fine, but the moment I got home, the weight of it all pressed down. The mortgage, the betrayal, the years of being used, it all caught up with me. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, hearing my dad's voice on repeat. We did what needed to be done. Family sacrifices for family. It wasn't just the financial part. It was the realization that the people I'd trusted most had been willing to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That they saw me not as their son, not as Emily's father, but as a tool, a resource, a means to keep their golden child afloat. That knowledge was like poison, seeping into every memory I had of them. Even the good memories, holidays, birthdays, family trips, started to feel tainted. I'd picture Mark being handed the bigger slice of cake, Jason getting the better present, my parents brushing off my accomplishments with a half-hearted "that's nice." I used to shrug those things off, but now they replayed with a clarity I couldn't ignore. And then came the whispers. Extended family started reaching out, an aunt texting me, "Hey, I heard you're causing trouble with your parents. Is everything okay?" A cousin calling to say, "Your mom told me you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you should apologize." They were poisoning the well, spinning their story before I could even open my mouth. I was being painted as the villain for refusing to be their doormat. It hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. I'd always known my parents played favorites, but I thought deep down they'd still protect me. I thought at the very least, they'd never outright betray me. Now, not only had they betrayed me, they were dragging my name through the mud to protect themselves. Emily noticed the toll it was taking on me. She'd find me sitting on the couch late at night, staring at nothing, and she'd quietly drape a blanket over my shoulders. Once, she said, "Dad, don't let them win twice. Don't let them take your peace, too." Her words hit harder than anything my parents had thrown at me. She was right. If I let this break me completely, I'd be teaching her that betrayal had the final word. That was the moment I started to shift. I was still hurting. Every bone in my body felt heavy, every thought tinged with bitterness, but I began to see a sliver of clarity. If my parents had crossed the line, then maybe it was time I stopped trying to stand on it. Maybe it was time to walk away entirely. I started small, quietly, carefully. I went through old files, bank statements, receipts. I looked at where the money had been going all these years, how many loans to Mark had never been paid back, how many emergencies for Jason were nothing more than new sneakers or another wrecked car. Seeing the numbers in black and white was like a cold shower. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a calculated drain. And I had been the well they tapped into without hesitation. I stopped answering their calls. The group chat went from constant pings to long stretches of silence, broken only by guilt-ridden messages. "Alan, please, let's talk." "Alan, you're being unfair." "Alan, don't punish Jason for our decisions." Mark even tried sending me voice notes, full of that smug arrogance. "You can't ignore this forever, bro. Family is family. You'll come around." But I didn't come around. I started building walls. Financial ones. Emotional ones. I met with a lawyer, quietly, anonymously. I asked questions about the mortgage, about what rights I had, about how to protect myself and Emily from the fallout. The lawyer looked at me like he'd seen this story 100 times before. He said, "You're not the first client to have family entangle them like this. But you need to decide if you're ready for what it takes to get free." That question haunted me, because freedom would mean burning bridges that had been smoldering my whole life. It would mean accepting that my parents weren't just flawed, they were dangerous to me and to Emily. And I wasn't sure I was ready to admit that out loud. Still, I took steps. I opened new accounts they didn't know about. I rerouted my paychecks. I started untangling myself from every financial string they'd tied me to. Each step was small, but each one felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. And yet, the pain didn't go away. Rock bottom isn't just about losing trust. It's about losing the illusion you built your life on. For me, that illusion was family. And sitting there night after night, staring at those mortgage papers, I realized the family I thought I had never really existed. One evening, Emily came into the living room with her cap and gown still hanging in the plastic cover. She said, "Can we just do something just us? A picture? A dinner? Something to mark it, even if it's late." I felt my throat tighten, because in all the chaos, in all the betrayal, I'd almost let her moment slip away entirely. So we did. We dressed up, just the two of us. I cooked her favorite meal. We took pictures in the backyard with the string lights on, her smiling in her gown while I clapped like she was walking across a stage. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of pride again, not just in her, but in myself, for refusing to let my parents steal every bit of joy from us. But even in that moment, even with Emily's laughter filling the air, I couldn't shake the reality pressing in on me. The mortgage was real. The betrayal was real. And if I didn't act soon, they'd keep finding ways to bind me tighter. I was at my lowest, hurt, isolated, painted as the villain to extended family, financially tied in ways I never agreed to. But somewhere in that darkness, a quiet plan began to take shape. Because if they thought this was rock bottom for me, they hadn't seen what I was capable of when I started climbing out. Climbing out of that pit didn't happen overnight. Rock bottom is sticky. It tries to keep you there, whispering doubts, replaying every failure and betrayal until you almost convince yourself to give in. But little by little, I started to move differently. It began with simple decisions. Waking up early to run instead of lying in bed scrolling through messages I no longer wanted to read. Cooking proper meals for Emily and myself instead of relying on takeout. Forcing myself to show up at work with my shoulders squared instead of slouched. Small choices, but each one was like a brick in a wall I was building. Not to shut myself in, but to shut my parents and brother out. My lawyer had warned me. Untangling myself from the mortgage wouldn't be simple. There would be hearings, documents, maybe even ugly accusations if my parents fought it. For a while, that scared me. The thought of sitting in a courtroom across from them, hearing them paint me as a selfish, ungrateful son, it was enough to keep me up at night. But then I realized something. I'd been hearing those accusations my whole life. You think you're better than us. You're selfish. You only care about yourself. Those words had already been hurled at me for decades. What difference would it make if they said them in front of a judge? So I started preparing, not with shouting or dramatic threats, but with quiet, meticulous planning. I gathered receipts, bank transfers, text messages, every piece of proof that I had been the one supporting them, not the other way around. Each file I put into the binder felt like armor. And slowly, the fear gave way to something else. Confidence. Work, too, became a refuge. I'd always done well in my career, but now I threw myself into it with a focus I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was survival, but the result was the same. I started excelling. Projects I'd been putting off got finished. New opportunities came my way. When my boss asked me to lead a major client presentation, I delivered it flawlessly. A month later, I got a promotion. With it came a salary bump that gave me even more breathing room. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family was busy trying to chain me down, life was actually lifting me up. Emily noticed the change, too. She started smiling more when she saw me at the kitchen table with my binder open, highlighting documents like a man on a mission. One night she said, "You seem lighter." And she was right. Not happier, not yet, but lighter. as if cutting those invisible ropes one by one was finally allowing me to stand tall. Meanwhile, my parents and Mark were unraveling. The messages kept coming, though they shifted in tone. First came the guilt trips, then the anger, and now, desperation. My mom sent me long messages about how they couldn't manage without me, how the late fees were unfair, how Jason shouldn't have to suffer because of my stubbornness. Every time I read the word Jason, I felt a spark of fury. He was a grown man, yet they still clung to him like he was their lifeline, while I was treated like the villain for finally saying enough. Then came the phone call that cemented everything. Mark called me, voice dripping with false concern, and said, "Look, Alan, we both know you can afford to keep helping. You just got that promotion, right? Don't make mom and dad pay the price because you're nursing some grudge. Jason's trying to get his life together. He just needs some more time. Be the bigger man. Be the bigger man." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. I realized in that moment they didn't even see me as a person with limits or needs. To them, I was an ATM with a pulse. They expected me to endlessly be the bigger man, while Jason never had to grow up at all. And something in me hardened. Instead of answering him, I started investing in myself and Emily. Literally and figuratively. I opened a new savings account just for her college fund, separate from anything they could ever touch. I talked to financial advisors about protecting assets, even about setting up a trust in her name so no one else could ever get their hands on what I was building. Every dollar I put into that account felt like an act of rebellion, like I was finally choosing my daughter over the endless black hole of my parents' and brothers' needs. Emily blossomed, too. Freed from the shadow of that disastrous party, she started leaning into her own plans. She applied for internships, took extra courses, started sketching out the future she wanted. Sometimes I'd catch her at the dining table, laptop open, muttering about application essays, and I'd feel this quiet pride knowing I was finally giving her the foundation she deserved, one not poisoned by manipulation. And slowly, people outside the immediate family began to notice the cracks. That same aunt who'd texted me weeks earlier reached out again. This time, she said, "Your mom's been telling people you abandoned them, but honestly, I'm starting to wonder if she's leaving things out. She's always spoiled Mark." It was a small thing, but it meant the world. For once, the narrative wasn't entirely theirs. For once, people were starting to see through the act. It didn't mean the pressure stopped. My parents tried new tactics, showing up at my office unannounced, leaving voicemails about how they might lose the house any day now. But each time, instead of caving, I documented. Dates, times, messages. A neat little trail of evidence. My lawyer, when I handed over the updated binder, nodded in approval. "You're doing everything right," he said. "If they push this, you'll be ready." And the more I prepared, the stronger I felt. Stronger than I had in years. One night, after weeks of quiet grinding, Emily and I sat in the backyard with the string lights glowing. She looked at me and said, "You seem different, Dad. Like stronger." I asked her what she meant, and she smiled. "It's like you're not scared of them anymore. It's like you finally realized you don't need them." She was right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. I wasn't trying to be the good son, the reliable one, the savior. I was just me, a father who loved his daughter, a man who was done being used. But the funny thing about gaining strength is that people notice. And when people who are used to controlling you notice, they panic. Which is exactly what started to happen. My parents' messages turned frantic. Mark showed up at my door more often, his smugness giving way to desperation. Jason even called me once, slurring his words, asking why I was ruining everything. And all the while, I kept climbing. Work kept rewarding me. Emily kept thriving. My confidence kept growing. It was like two separate worlds, theirs crumbling, mine rising. And the higher I climbed, the more dangerous I knew it would feel to them. Because nothing scares people who rely on control more than the moment they realize they've lost it. And that's when I started to see the outlines of what my revenge could be. Not the petty kind, not screaming or throwing things, but the kind that comes from power. From standing tall while they scramble. From letting them feel, maybe for the first time in their lives, what it's like to be powerless. I wasn't ready yet, but the pieces were falling into place. And I could feel, deep in my bones, that the next move was going to change everything. When you hit the bottom, you start learning which things are fragile and which things are just loud. Pride is loud. Appearances are loud. But paper is quiet and honest. And if you know how to read it, paper will tell you everything you need to know. That's what I learned in part 6, Set Up for Revenge. It wasn't one big heroic moment. It was a slow, surgical unwrapping of secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The first crack came because of something boring, my promotion. Part of the new role involved meeting a client who worked in banking compliance. We were introduced at a work event, small talk and smiles, and in 15 minutes we were chest deep in stories about family weirdness and trust. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd been dragged into some mortgage mess and needed to know what the bank could and couldn't do when a borrower's name had been added without their consent. He gave me a casual, "That's nasty," then said the kind of thing people in his line of work tend to say without thinking. If you've been added fraudulently, there are ways to unpick it. But you need proof. Transaction records, identity verification, notarized forms. If the paperwork doesn't line up, it's on the bank to investigate. He didn't know he'd handed me a weapon. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook and a worrying kind of clarity. Proof, I wrote, and then made a list. Dates, conversations, receipts, wire transfers. I realized I'd been operating under feelings for too long, loyalty, guilt, hope, when what I needed was evidence. So I began collecting it. It was tedious and sometimes humiliating. I spent hours combing through old bank statements I'd downloaded years ago, tracing the payments that had gone to my parents. I found transfers labeled loan that had never been paid back, direct debits that covered their utilities, and a suspicious pattern of cash transfers coinciding with Jason emergencies. There were texts where my mother thanked me for always being there, and emails from their bank confirming account changes I'd never authorized. The more I collected, the more the neat, twined picture of my life with them started to look like a spreadsheet of favors nobody intended to settle. I hired a private investigator. I hated doing it. I felt like I was using professional spies on my own family. But the guy I found had a quiet competence that made me feel less like a paranoid son and more like a man building a case. Within a week, he turned up bank transfer confirmations showing that, yes, money had been routinely moved from accounts controlled by my parents into an account with Mark's name on it. Not one-off reimbursements. Large, regular payments with memos like auto and help. He also dug up one thing I hadn't expected: copies of documents sent to the mortgage company that used my name, but were dated before I knew anything was happening. The signatures on several of the forms were suspicious, crooked letters, inconsistent pressure, stuff a handwriting analyst later told me was a red flag for forgery. I remember sitting in my car in the rain, staring at those scanned documents on my phone. My hands shook. It was worse than I'd feared, and somehow crisper, more actionable. This wasn't family dysfunction anymore. It was a deliberate pattern of taking and obfuscation. They'd built a financial safety net for Mark, one that tied me directly to their obligations. And they'd done it without my consent. Next, I hired a forensic accountant. The accountant was blunt in the way only numbers can be blunt. "They've been moving money into a shell structure," she said after 2 weeks of digging. "There's a business account with odd deposits and distributions. Mark's the listed beneficiary on several transfers that correspond to what you thought were loans. It's set up to look like legitimate family support, but the flow of funds points to ongoing diversion." She printed out charts and arrows and timelines. On the paper, my parents' bank looked like a fountain whose streams all led to the same bucket, Mark's. Armed with that, I did something else I'd never imagined doing. I started talking strategically. I reached out to my aunt, the one who had texted earlier, and I met with her in a coffee shop under the guise of catching up. I asked careful questions, not because I wanted gossip, but because I needed corroboration. She told me things I already suspected. My parents had been quietly bailing Mark out of business setbacks. A vanishingly small number of people had actually seen the invoices Mark claimed were for repairs, and several neighbors remembered Mark bragging about buying new tools and toys while Mom's car stayed in the driveway for months. My aunt's face tightened when she said it, and I felt a cold satisfaction. She gave me names, people who had reasons to speak, if asked. I also started documenting emotional manipulation in a way the courts would understand. I saved voicemails where my mother used my father's health as a cudgel. I had my phone extract that showed the exact times they had been in my house, the timestamps of their texts, the photos they had shared pretending to be concerned. It felt petty to save 100 little humiliations, but in aggregate, they showed intent, a pattern of control, not familial chaos. Then there was the mortgage itself. The bank compliance contact helped me request a file review. Banks, especially after the financial crisis, hate the words fraud and unauthorized. The compliance officer told me how their internal escalation worked and, more importantly, what would move the needle: notarized statements, handwriting analysis, a criminal complaint for forgery if there was cause. It felt like learning a new language: statutes, affidavits, chain of custody. I bought the dictionary. One night, after a day of interviews and document collection, Mark came to our neighborhood. He texted, "We need to talk, Alan. This is getting out of hand." He tried to make it sound like he was worried about Mom. He came to the door and tried his old routine: half charm, half demand. I invited him in like I had a dozen times before. Only this time, I had a copy of the forensic report on the table. I watched him watch it. His mouth went thin. He shifted in his seat. He asked for explanations, feigned ignorance. But it was there: the flows, the memos, the match between transfers and Jason emergencies. He had the look of a man counting the exits from a sinking ship and realizing his lifeline was a rope he'd been stealing. While all of this was happening, I did something quieter but more binding. I put Emily's future beyond their reach. I met with an estate attorney and set up a trust in her name. I moved assets I controlled, savings, investments, into accounts that were legally protected. Not flashy, not dramatic, but practical. Change beneficiary designations, set up multi-sig accounts, draft trust language that would make it legally messy for anyone to touch what was clearly hers. I set up an LLC to manage any property purchases I might make down the line in order to keep ownership clean and insulated. The lawyer who helped me do it had a kind of calm that was reassuring. You can protect what's yours. They can sue, but the courts like clean documentation. The paperwork felt like armor. There were softer moves, too. I began to cultivate allies in the extended family. Quiet conversations, little truths told off the record. One cousin admitted over coffee that she'd long suspected my parents favored Mark, but was too afraid to say anything out loud. Another family friend told me, in confidence, that there were old tax returns missing schedules and that it wouldn't be hard for the IRS to take an interest if someone pointed them in that direction. I didn't make threats. I simply filed things. With the PI's report, the forensic accountant's charts, and the bank compliance contacts guidance, I had a dossier that looked like an argument prepared for a judge and a prosecutor. Then the phone call came that made everything feel suddenly urgent. My compliance contact at the bank called me outside of business hours, voice hushed. "We've opened a preliminary inquiry," she said. "We can place a temporary freeze pending verification, but we need one thing from you: a sworn affidavit describing the unauthorized addition of your name and any supporting documents you have." In other words, if I signed and handed over what I had, the bank would act. They would investigate. They could even reverse certain transfers if they found fraud. I thought of my father's voice, the way he had tried to normalize the theft. I thought of Emily's small, brave face at the party when she didn't cry but couldn't smile. I thought of Mark, strolling under a banner he hadn't earned. I felt a fierce, sober thing settle inside me. Responsibility, but not the old kind. This was responsibility to my daughter, to the truth, to the idea that people who weaponize family shouldn't be allowed to do it with impunity. Signing the affidavit was the scariest thing I did. It meant there was no more pretending. It meant legal papers, hearings, the slow machinery of justice grinding forward. It meant that faces I'd loved for 46 years could be subpoenaed, that their lies might be exposed in black and white. I signed anyway. After that, the world narrowed to waiting and preparation. The bank put temporary holds on certain transfers and flagged accounts for review. My lawyer filed a request for emergency relief to prevent any further movement of funds out of accounts that the forensic report suggested were being siphoned. The PI continued to collect witness statements. The aunt I'd met with agreed to testify about Mark's inconsistencies if called. My cousin texted support. People I never thought would side with me were quietly aligning in ways that gave me strange new power. Power is a clean word for a dangerous thing. I felt it like a new suit, unfamiliar at first, then fitted to my shoulders. It frightened me to realize how fast I could turn the tables. A bank inquiry, a legal freeze, witness statements, an affidavit. Suddenly, the men who had always been able to call me at will were the ones who were vulnerable. But gaining leverage wasn't about breaking them. It was about giving myself options. If they chose to fight, there were courts and investigations and, possibly, criminal exposure for forgery and fraud. If they chose to negotiate, there were terms I could accept that protected Emily and me. If they panicked, there were reputational costs for them. None of those outcomes were pretty. None of them were simple. But for the first time since the banner in that hall told Emily's moment to take a seat, I felt like the future was mine to shape. And then something unexpected happened. My dad called me late one night. His voice was strained, a man who had been used to instructing now pleading. "Alan," he said, "we need to talk in person. Please, just come over." For a moment, the old instincts, boyhood respect, the desire for family to stay whole, pulled at me. But then I thought of the affidavit on file, the bank compliance team ready to act, the PI's timeline. I thought of Emily's trust, sealed and safe. I agreed to go, but I didn't go empty-handed. I didn't go to be manipulated again. I went with a copy of the forensic report, the PI's timeline, and the bank compliance confirmation on my phone. I went with a lawyer calling in to listen in if needed. I went with the quiet awareness that, for the first time in my life, I had options they didn't expect. I walked up their walkway like a man walking to a negotiation table. The porch light threw their faces into a familiar relief. The same faces that had once been my whole world, now briefly looking surprised to see me showing up on their terms. My father opened the door with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You came," he said. "Yes," I answered. "We need to talk." Inside, the air tasted like late-night coffee and old routines. They sat where they always had. Mark hovered near the doorway. My mother kept wiping her hands on a dish towel like she had just been pretending to do chores while the kettle boiled. For a breath, everything threatened to collapse back into the past. Polite words, the same choreography. Then I placed a copy of the documents on the coffee table. Their reactions were all the colors of shock and calculation. My mother's face went pale. Mark's jaw clenched. My father's smile faltered. The quiet that felt absolute, as if the house itself was listening in. I watched them look at pages that traced years of movement, at handwriting reports that questioned signatures, at charts that showed how money flowed toward one son and away from another. I hadn't come to strike. Not yet. I'd come so they could see, in detail, what their decisions had wrought. I'd come so they could choose. Come clean and fix it, or fight me and let the bank, the courts, and the truth do it for them. That's where I left them on that night. Faces lit by lamplight, papers between us like cold glass. My father opened his mouth, but there were no words that could write what had been done. Mark looked like a man calculating exits. My mother looked broken in a way I had never seen her, not from grief, but from the sudden recognition that the mask had slipped. And then my dad said something I didn't expect. He didn't beg or shout. He asked quietly, "What do you want, Alan?" It was the question I had been preparing to answer for months. The answer would determine everything. I opened my mouth to speak, feeling the weight of all the little decisions stacked behind me. The trust for Emily, the affidavit, the freeze, the witnesses, the lawyer on speed dial. And then I stopped. Because some moves you make public, some moves you keep private, some weapons you put on the table, and some you keep sheathed until the right moment. I said nothing for now. I let the question hang there like the last note of a song. I let them feel the silence, the power, the choice. They waited. I let them wait. That's where I left it, with my next move wrapped tight in the quiet I had built. The setup was complete. The pieces were on the board. The game had become one of patience and precision. When the pieces were finally arranged, it turned out the most effective revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was surgical. Revenge that humiliated from a position of strength is rarely a scene in a hall or a shouting match at a kitchen table. It's the quiet removal of the scaffolding someone uses to prop themselves up. I had spent months building that scaffold in secret. Documents, witnesses, legal protections, and a trust for Emily that was beyond their reach. Part 7 was simply the act of removing the ladder beneath them and watching them scramble. I started where the bank had shown me to start, with paperwork in process. The compliance team liked being methodical. They liked boxes checked and dates verified. They had put temporary holds on suspicious transfers and begun opening a formal inquiry. I worked closely with them, submitting the notarized affidavit, the PI's findings, the handwriting expert's notes, and the forensic accountant's report. It felt clinical, unromantic, but it was effective. Within days, the bank placed more substantive restrictions on accounts linked to the transfers we'd uncovered. They flagged distributions to Mark and froze any movement that looked like it was trying to be funneled out. The bank wasn't petty. It was powerful, and once its machinery turned, it could make sudden things, like access to cash, disappear overnight. When the freeze happened, the first ripple hit their daily life. Utilities that had been auto-paid bounced. Automatic transfers they depended on failed. Mark started getting polite but insistent calls from vendors saying invoices were unpaid. At first, they blamed the bank, then each other, and then finally they realized something worse. Someone had noticed the pattern. My parents tried to call me, but I had trained myself not to pick up. Let them panic a little, I told myself. Let them feel the uncertainty I'd lived with for years. That same week, I did two public things quietly and with intention. First, I told two close, trusted family members, people I knew wouldn't gossip but would act if asked, to be ready to confirm dates and events if needed. They agreed. Second, I reached out to a neighbor Mark had recently borrowed from, someone who had paid him back once and knew the pattern of loans. The neighbor's eyes widened when I asked if he'd be willing to provide a written statement about what he'd seen. "I've been waiting for someone to do something," he said. That phrase tasted like vindication. The legal freeze didn't stop with the bank. My lawyer pushed for emergency relief to prevent any further draining of assets that could affect the mortgage or Emily's safety. The affidavit and the forensic reports were persuasive. The judge issued a temporary injunction preventing transfers from certain accounts and ordered a preliminary hearing. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family argument. It was an official legal matter with paper trails and dates and a courtroom somewhere in the near future. As the legal cords tightened, the social consequences began to unfurl. People talk when money stops showing up. Mark's contractor calls went unanswered, and someone forwarded a screenshot of an unpaid invoice to a local Facebook group where neighbors swapped business recommendations. The court document was public record. Some nosy relative posted a cryptic status about family frauds, and the thread started. I didn't post anything. I didn't need to. The internet and human curiosity did my work for me. People who had once nodded politely at my parents began to ask questions. Mark, who had always used loud charm to deflect, started to look smaller. He came to my door one afternoon, eyes bloodshot, voice sharp with a kind of panic he'd never shown before. "You don't have to do this," he hissed. "We can talk. Pay me back, set up a plan. You know I'll make things right." He sounded like someone bargaining at the bottom of a hole. I let him speak, and I let him scramble. I handed him a printed copy of the forensic accountant's summary and watched his face go red as he read through the flows that led straight to him. The man who'd once leaned on my generosity looked suddenly exposed and amateurish in the face of explicit numbers. But the nastiest, most satisfying part wasn't the freeze or Mark's panic. It was watching my parents try to recover their preferred narrative and failing. They called every relative they could, trying to spin their way out of it. "It's a misunderstanding," they told anyone who would listen. "Our son Alan is overreacting." They tried to paint me as the unreasonable one, the emotional son who couldn't forgive a small mistake. That story didn't stick with people who'd been quietly watching for years. The aunt who had confessed her suspicions came forward with a calm statement about Mark's sudden lifestyle changes when he was supposed to be struggling. A neighbor produced bank photos that matched deposits. The PI's timeline synchronized with a cousin's memories of moved furniture and unexplained cash. It was like watching a house of cards built by decades of smiles and selective memory collapse under a gentle, precise gust. One evening, after the bank had issued a preliminary report and the injunction was in place, I received a thin envelope in the post. The handwriting was my mother's, shaky but careful. Inside was a short note. "We're sorry you feel this way. Come over and talk." It sounded like contrition, but I'd learned to read between the lines. I called my lawyer instead. He advised me to take nothing at face value and to use any direct contact as part of the record. "If they reach out, acknowledge them, but keep dates and messages. It'll help your case," he said. So I called back and left a voicemail that was polite, measured, and noted the date and time. Every small step was a thread I was keeping for the future. While the legal and social pressures mounted, I made strategic moves to protect my daughter from the fallout and to reinforce our independence. I finalized the trust documents, updated beneficiary designations, and transferred certain liquid assets into accounts outside of my parents' reach. I paid off a small investment property in cash and put it under the LLC with Emily listed as the intended beneficiary upon certain conditions. When my parents realized some of the funds they had assumed were still in our accounts had been sequestered, the panic in their voice was almost audible through the calls they left. The media of our small town, the local paper, picked up a neutral summary of the injunction. It was brief and factual, a legal dispute involving a local family and allegations of unauthorized account changes. No sensational language, just facts. But facts have a way of contaminating rumors. People began to sidestep the family gossip and mention, with cautious sympathy, that maybe something more was happening. The social atmosphere shifted from "Alan is being cruel" to "I wonder what's actually true here." That shift was a turning tide. When the tide turns, it's easier to see what was washed away and what's left clinging to the rocks. You might think that all this would make me giddy, some sort of revenge high. But the truth was steadier and stranger. There was satisfaction, yes, a real, clean satisfaction that only comes from writing a ledger. But there was also sorrow. Every legal success felt like a loss. A family that had been whole enough to laugh together at silly things was now a study case for a judge. There was grief under the satisfaction, a mourning for the life I'd thought I had. That grief kept the whole thing sober. I didn't want to break them, I told myself. I wanted to remove the dangerous scaffolding so Emily could grow up unafflicted by their choices. That aim kept me from gloating. Then came the confrontation I had waited for. The bank's preliminary findings had been enough for the mortgage company to pause certain processes. They requested, formally, an explanation for how my name had been added and asked for verification from all involved. The court scheduled a hearing to evaluate the injunction more fully. My parents had to choose: admit wrongdoing and attempt to settle, or fight it out and risk exposure and potential criminal referrals for forged signatures. They chose to fight, at least at first. The morning I learned they intended to litigate, Mark sent me an email that tried, poorly, to adopt a conciliatory tone while simultaneously blaming external accountants, misapplied payments, and clerical errors. He tried to insist that any transfers had been loans, all of which were intended to be repaid. The PI's timeline, the bank's frozen transfers, and the forensic handwriting reports made that claim look brittle. Still, their lawyer drafted a reply that aimed to buy time, to sow doubt in the forensic analysis, and to hint at procedural errors in the bank's freeze. I expected it. They were trying to use legal complexity as a shield, relying on the idea that my stamina might run out before the truth did. They had used endurance as their defense for years. So I made a decision that would change the dynamic. Instead of letting them litigate in private with their lawyers' smokescreens, I pushed for public clarity. I asked my lawyer to file a motion for expedited discovery and to ask the judge to allow certain depositions to be recorded. I wanted the record clear, I wanted witnesses to be formally sworn, and I wanted the chain of evidence tight. That move risked exposure for everyone involved, including me. This was not a risk to take lightly. But if the truth was on my side, public, structured scrutiny would be the most effective way to unmask the pattern. My lawyer warned me it would get messy and that I should be prepared for anything. I was. The motions were filed. The judge granted a narrow order for expedited discovery. Dates for depositions were set. My parents' faces when I told them were a mixture of anger and fear. Mark called that night, yelling about betrayal and how I was escalating things. But the fear was clear. The man who had always expected me to bail him out now had to prepare sworn testimony about his finances. The power had shifted. Just when I thought the gears had settled into motion, something happened that I hadn't entirely anticipated. A former business partner of Mark's, someone he'd cut ties with 2 years prior, reached out to me with documents showing apparent invoices Mark had used to justify transfers that didn't match any actual work done. The partner offered to give a deposition. It was the kind of corroboration that, once sworn, would carry weight in front of a judge. It was the small, devastating detail that could turn a messy fight into a legal winter for Mark. I sat there at my kitchen table with that partner's emails in front of me and realized how irreversible this all felt. The stage was set, depositions scheduled, banks investigating, freezes in place, public records beginning to stack up. I had achieved what I'd set out to do, remove the safety net that had allowed my family to treat me like a resource, and in its place, I had created a shield for Emily. And yet, even with the power in my hands, I felt the tension of the moment like a held breath. I knew the next steps, testimony, perhaps criminal referrals, negotiations, settlements, could still go in 1,000 directions. There was the risk of counterclaims, of reputation-scorching lies released in panic. There was also the possibility that my parents would finally see the reality and take honest steps to fix what they'd broken. Both outcomes terrified me in different ways. So I prepared. I gathered witnesses, fortified the trust paperwork, and rehearsed the statements I would give. I made sure Emily had someone to be with on days things got ugly. I made contingency plans for her schooling if the fallout impacted our lives. I did everything quietly, steadily, like a man closing the zipper on a suitcase and bringing it to the door. The day before depositions, my mother sent a text. "If this is about Jason, we'll talk. Please, think of the family." My fingers hovered over the reply. I could have answered, "I have thought of family. Your family, my daughter's family, the one you betrayed." I typed nothing. Not yet. Because the most important part of this wasn't the humiliation. They'd had plenty of humiliation already. It was the timing. Power is most potent when wielded precisely. I had orchestrated pauses, freezes, and revelations not because I wanted to hurt them without cause, but because I wanted to ensure the truth had room to breathe and for Emily to be protected if it blew up. And so I waited, suit pressed, statements ready, heart steady, aware that the next day's testimony might change everything. The depositions were the turning point. All the whispers, all the accusations, all the Allens being dramatic narratives, suddenly they had to face a recorder, a stenographer, and a lawyer asking precise questions under oath. Watching my parents sit in stiff-backed chairs, sworn in, was surreal. They looked older than I remembered, not because of time, but because of exposure. For years, they had hidden behind family dinners and polite smiles. Now there was no banner to hide under, no hall to commandeer, just the quiet, unyielding pressure of the truth. Mark went first. He tried to swagger, like always, tossing out half-smiles and shrugs as if the whole thing were beneath him. But depositions don't reward charm. The lawyer laid out the transfers, dates, amounts, account numbers. "Can you explain why these funds, originally deposited by your parents, were transferred into your account labeled auto repairs when no invoices for such repairs exist?" Silence. A shuffle of papers. A stammer. Then, "I don't recall." That phrase became his lifeline. But the more he used it, the tighter the noose grew. The bank's records, the forensic charts, the PI's notes. Each, "I don't recall," made him look less like a victim and more like a man dodging the inevitable. When my mother spoke, her voice trembled. She tried to paint it as maternal worry, as parents making hard choices. "We thought Alan would understand," she said. "He's always been responsible. He's always helped. It wasn't malicious, it was just family." The lawyer didn't blink. "Did Alan authorize you to sign his name on these mortgage documents?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "We knew he'd help," she whispered. That was it. The closest she came to admitting they'd forged me into their plan. My father tried authority, like he always had. "This is blown out of proportion," he declared. "Our son is ungrateful. We've given him everything, and this is how he repays us." The lawyer calmly slid over the handwriting analysis, the affidavit, the bank's internal review noting irregularities. "Is this your son's signature, sir?" My father looked down, jaw set, then refused to answer. The silence was louder than any denial. When it was over, they walked out pale, tight-lipped. Mark stormed out, muttering about lawyers being parasites. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father gave me a look that was half fury, half defeat. And for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I sat there with Emily waiting outside the room, her hand resting on my shoulder, and I thought, we finally took the power back. The fallout was swift. The bank issued its findings. The mortgage signature was deemed unauthorized, fraudulent. My name was removed from the loan, and the bank flagged my parents for potential criminal review. That word, fraud, followed them like a shadow. The injunction remained in place while the courts sorted through the diverted funds. Mark faced civil claims for the misappropriated money, with the threat of tax audits looming. The former business partner followed through, testifying to fabricated invoices. Piece by piece, the facade of competence and control that had kept them safe for decades collapsed. The social tide shifted too. Relatives who had once parroted my parents' narrative fell silent. A few reached out quietly, apologizing for doubting me, for believing the spin. My aunt sent a simple text. "I always knew you were telling the truth." At gatherings, when my parents walked in, conversations paused. People didn't rush to greet them anymore. Respect that had been assumed was now withheld. And they hated it. Mark lost more than reputation. Without the easy flow of money, his lifestyle crumbled. The car was repossessed. The side businesses shuttered. I heard from a cousin that he'd moved back in with my parents. The golden child finally returned to the nest he had drained dry. But this time, the nest was withering. Bills piled up. Repairs went undone. The house, once kept afloat by my quiet payments, began to look worn. My parents tried reaching out, calls, letters, even showing up once more at my door. But I had nothing left to say. One evening, my father left a voicemail that summed it all up. "You've destroyed this family, Alan. I hope you're proud." I listened once, then deleted it. Because the truth was, I hadn't destroyed the family. They had. Years of favoritism, of manipulation, of theft dressed as tradition. This was the cost of their choices. And what about Emily? She thrived. With the trust secured and the college fund untouched by their chaos. She stepped into her future without the weight of their entitlement on her shoulders. At her small, private celebration, just the two of us and a few close friends, she gave a toast. "To my dad," she said, smiling through tears, "for teaching me that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you strong." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. And in that moment, I knew I'd done the right thing. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still pangs of grief, flashes of memory where I wish things had been different. But grief is lighter when you know it's clean, when it isn't tangled with guilt or doubt. I grieved the family I thought I had, not the one I actually did. And every time I looked at Emily, I felt something else too. Pride. Not just in her, but in myself. For once, I hadn't let them define me. Months later, I drove past my parents' house. The lawn was overgrown. The paint was peeling. A foreclosure notice hung crooked on the front door. I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. I just looked once, then kept driving. Some endings don't need speeches. At home, Emily was waiting with a stack of acceptance letters. She spread them out on the kitchen table, her eyes bright. "Wherever I go," she said, "I want you there with me." I smiled, feeling that quiet weight lift for good. Because the truth is, revenge isn't always about watching them fall. It's about making sure you rise. And we had. The last time my father's words echoed in my mind. "What do you want, Alan?" I finally knew the answer. What I wanted was simple. Never again to see my daughter cry under someone else's banner. And that's exactly what I gave her.